Good morning. I hope you had a great weekend. It's hard to believe, but we're going to meet 44 times in this class together. And Wednesday is the 11th meeting, which means that we're 25% through the semester already. We're halfway to the midpoint, which is just almost unbelievable how quickly that's going, and that we've been able to pull this off in the middle of COVID. We can certainly thank God for that. We're going to have a pretty interesting discussion today, and we're going to look at what scholars call textual criticism. And textual criticism is kind of an unfortunate name because it's not criticizing a text. Rather, textual criticism is the universal name in all fields when you have two ancient manuscripts and they differ, how you go about deciding which one is original and which one is not. Textual criticism and what we're going to go over in this class would be the exact same if we were studying Shakespeare. And if you've ever been to the Folger Museum in Washington, D.C., right beside the U.S. Supreme Court, if you go into the Folger, they'll have ancient folio editions. I think they have 41 ancient folio editions of the earliest manuscripts of William Shakespeare. And if you're fortunate enough to get a reader's card, they'll actually bring it out and you can read it for yourself and decide, okay, there are different early editions to Shakespeare. Which one is the one that has the claim to be what he wrote? If we were in rabbinical literature, we would study textual criticism. Textual criticism exists in classical Latin text and in classical Greek text. So even though the name sounds like you're somehow passing judgment on a text, what textual criticism really is about is how do you know what an ancient text said. And that's what we're going to look at today. So before we dive into this, please remember to take attendance quiz 10. So we're going to make some observations about debated text in the New Testament. And there are three principal debated texts. One is the ending of the Gospel of Mark. Many copies of the Gospel of Mark end with verse 8, where it says, "But the women went out and told no one nothing." That's what it says in the Greek, for they were afraid. And many versions of Mark end with that passage. Some copies have what's called the longer ending. And if you've ever read that ending, it talks about how the followers of Jesus will handle snakes, how all the followers of Jesus will speak in tongues and drink deadly poison. So some manuscripts have that ending, some don't. How do we decide which one is the right ending? Another passage is called the pericope of the adulteress. And pericope is just the Greek word for paragraph. And it's the story that we're going to look at today in John, where this woman, taken in the very act of adultery, is dragged to the temple to Jesus, and her accusers want to know if she should be stoned to death, as it says in Moses' Pentateuch. And then what some people call the testimony of the Trinity, which is the verse that says these three are one, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, the Bible is full of verses that support the Trinity. In fact, there's no verse on which any major doctrine in Christianity depends that's debated. That is, take the worst manuscript that you have for the New Testament and you still have Christianity. But some people, particularly those who are arguing for one particular version of the Greek Bible, will often call 1 John 5:7 the testimony of the Trinity, where many manuscripts say these three bear witness, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these three are one thing. And so there's a question, what does that particular verse mean? And so in terms of the real debated passages in the New Testament, it's simply these three passages. These three are the main ones about which scholars debate. Most of the time, when you're talking about textual criticism, you're talking about trying to decide whether the Greek text said Christ Jesus or Jesus Christ. So it has to do with the order of words, or whether or not it's the church or just church. You have plenty of manuscripts where you have passages like that, which are insignificant in terms of theology, but still important in terms of deciding what the ancient writers actually wrote. And in the Old Testament textual criticism is a little different, but there, by and large, you have widespread agreement. In fact, when those texts were copied in antiquity and when they're copied today, they're still copied by hand today. And when a person finishes copying, someone will go through and count up all the letters. So if it were in English, they would count up all the A's, the B's, the C's, and they would come up with a table of numbers. And in antiquity, if those numbers did not match exactly, then that manuscript was defective and would be burned. It takes about a year to copy the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It cost about $250,000 today to have it done by hand. And if at the end of the day, when you go through and count up those letters, if the letters are wrong in terms of numbers, then that $250,000 manuscript would be burned, because people have taken this very, very important in terms of getting this exactly right. In the Old Testament, it's chiefly passages that are Christological text. So the places in the Old Testament where you have real debate, is it the passage, they pierced my hands and feet, or is it they surrounded my hands and feet like a lion? The difference between those two readings is the length of one letter. And so you have passages like that where there isn't widespread debate, but when you get down to these specifically Christological passages, you do have great debate. And so what we want to do today is look at the evidence. So in this manuscript, an important manuscript called Codex Sinaiticus, I think this might be the oldest complete manuscript of the Greek New Testament that we have. This is called Codex Sinaiticus because it was found at St. Catherine's Monastery, which is at the foot of Mount Sinai. In fact, I think the man who discovered it was Count von Tischendorf, or it may have been Count Zinzendorf, I don't remember, but one of the famous counts went and he was collecting manuscripts, and he was so proud of the treasure trove that he had collected, and he was boasting to the monks there at St. Catherine's. And one of the monks says, "Would you like to see the copy of the Bible that I have?" And he brought out Codex Sinaiticus, and Zinzendorf nearly had a heart attack because he realized this was the oldest complete manuscript. And then the monk told him, I have a closet full of them, and the ones that were kind of rotten, I've been starting fires with. And you better believe Zinzendorf almost had a heart attack then. Well, eventually these manuscripts were purchased. I believe this one is in the British Library in London. This is the ending of Mark. And so this manuscript was written in the 4th century. And the ending of Mark says here in Greek, and they told nothing to no one, for they were afraid. And my little pen isn't working today for some reason. And it ends with the, for they were afraid. And then the very next, okay, now I just think my computer may be demon possessed or something. Maybe we'll give up on that. It starts with John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And you can see there's no verse there, 9 and following, about drinking poison or all Christians speaking in tongues. And so here you've got an early manuscript that doesn't have what's called the longer ending. And if we go to another text, Codex Vaticanus, and you might guess that this book, this codex is in the Vatican Library, you can see it ends in exactly the same place. They told nothing to no one, for they were afraid, period. And that's where the gospel ends. We've seen in this class before that there are 17 or 18 verses. There's some debates, some do 17, some 18, where from the judgment of people who examine manuscripts, they say when the guy put the verse numbers in, he was wrong on these 17 places. And so even though they were in the verses that he numbered, we don't believe they have a right to stand, and so we're not going to print them in modern editions. And you can see that the ESV is very upfront and tells you that there are 17 of these places where the man who put in the verse numbers, his manuscript was wrong. And so when we come to the ending of Mark, what you'll get in most modern Bibles is a printing of the text, but with a note. And those who are being more diplomatic will say some of the earliest manuscripts. Others, a little more bluntly, will say none of the earlier manuscripts include this, but they'll all mark them out for us to say, you need to look at the evidence and see, do you believe that this is what Mark wrote or not? And in the in the Greek text of Mark, it turns out that there are 4 different endings. There's the nothing ending that ends with they tell no one for they were afraid. Then we have what's called the shorter ending, which is a 2-verse ending that says all the things having been commanded to those around Peter strenuously they announced, and after these things Jesus himself from the east until the west sent out through them the holy and uncorrupted kerygma of eternal salvation. The kerygma is the preaching amen. And so some manuscripts have this 2-verse ending. Lots of manuscripts have what is numbered in our Bibles 9 through I think 21, and that's the familiar ending that is printed in double brackets in the ESV. And then some manuscripts will have the shorter ending, the 2-verse ending, and have what's called the longer ending in the same manuscripts. And some of those manuscripts will even mark out these portions with what's called obeli, or what would be to us an asterisk. So what would And when we come to a Greek text, a good Greek text will actually list all the witnesses to each particular ending, and even down to the individual manuscripts. So you see this essay with this superscript MSS, and that means some manuscripts of this ancient Sahidic version, some manuscripts of the Bohairic, some manuscripts of the Ethiopian, manuscript 00099. And so they go through, and so we have access to what each of the 5,000 plus manuscripts say. So when we come to the ending of Mark, there are four different witnesses that are saying, listen to me, this is what should be in the text. There's the nothing ending that ends in 6:8. There's the two-sentence summary. There's the longer ending. And then there are manuscripts that have both the shorter and both the longer ending. And so which one of those should we accept as right? Well, that's the issue that we need to talk about when we're talking about textual criticism. How can I be sure that what I have in my Bible is what the authors wrote? And many will say, Bart Ehrman will say, look, there are so many mistakes in the manuscripts that you can't even begin to be certain about what any of it says. And some people, very well-meaning, would say, why get involved with this anyway? Why not just trust the Holy Spirit to lead us in the truth? And all those are interesting ideas, but I want to empower you this morning to know what are the rules that people come to when they have to make decisions like this. Why is it that you have these Greek editors saying these verses don't belong in our printed text? Well, they're following 5 rules, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at each one of those 5 rules and say, is that a valid rule or not? Do I believe that rule makes sense? And these are called the canons of textual criticism, and they're so important that many of them have Latin names. And so sometimes you'll hear people talk about lectio oh my goodness, what is it? Lectio is reading, and I can't remember the word for earlier, but patior is better. So the earlier reading is better. A second canon is the reading that is most widely diverse geographically is the one to be preferred. When you have 2 readings and one is a reading that doesn't seem to make sense and the other reading makes perfect sense, usually it's the one that is the harder reading that's to be preferred. Usually, according to textual critics, the shorter reading is to be preferred because scribes have a tendency to add rather than to subtract. And then the queen of all the canons, the one that you come to after you've looked at all of them, is the reading that can explain how all the other readings got there, is the one that we should prefer. And so we, as intelligent readers, need to ask the question, do I believe these canons? Are these canons of textual criticism right? Well, let's look at this one, the earlier reading. So what you have when you come to the earlier reading, and if I could just get my pointer here, it may help us. What you have, and what text critics want us to think about, is the original manuscript. And text critics call that the autograph. So imagine when John wrote John, he obviously sat down with a piece of paper and wrote it out. That's called the autograph. That is the original manuscript. Now, we don't have the autographs for any of the writings of the Bible. So what we have are the copies. And you can imagine if you were John, you might send a copy to Jerusalem and Ephesus and Rome and Alexandria. You would want lots of churches to read your work. And so what we have is the autograph, and it would be great if we had the autograph, but that was written on probably papyrus, and it long since has rotted away. We don't have the autographs anymore, but what we do have are copies. And some of those are very old copies, and some are not so old copies. And you can imagine over time that you would have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. When people come to text criticism, regardless of whatever field they're in, a manuscript that is older than the other manuscripts usually has the right of being preferred to a later manuscript. And if we were in the non-COVID days where we could just talk and there weren't barriers, I would ask the question, do you think that's right? Do you think that's a fair canon? And most people come to it and say yes, because if you have this manuscript, and if you have this manuscript, but imagine it centuries and centuries later, this manuscript was copied once, this manuscript may have been copied 25 times. So when you have two competing manuscript traditions, usually it's the older one that should be preferred. And that's a principle that would be true in Shakespeare, in rabbinic studies, in Latin textual criticism, any field where you have two ancient manuscripts, usually it's the older one that should be preferred. So what we have today is maybe something like this. We have 5,000 manuscripts, but we have nothing like all the manuscripts that were ever copied. But we have a few that are really old. When I was a PhD student in Great Britain, I was at the University of Sheffield, and we were maybe 60 miles away or something like that from the John Rylands Library in the University of Manchester. And at that time, the John Rylands had the oldest copy of the New Testament. And about 5 of us went over there with letters trying to get into the Rylands Library to do our research. And we didn't know if we were going to get in or not, but we came to the very official bursar or porter or whatever you call it, and we asked to be let in the library, and to our amazement, he let us in the library. And so we spent the day at that very nice library. And my friend, Chris Thomas, he teaches at Lee University now. He was a lot older than the rest of us, and he said, you know, John Rylands has P52, Papyrus 52, which is the oldest Greek manuscript that we have. And I said to Chris, I said, yeah, I know. And he said, let's ask him if we can see it. And I said, Chris, we're not even supposed to be in here. We don't even have cards for Manchester students. We've kind of snuck in this research library, and you're asking the guy to bring us the Holy Grail so we can look at it. And he said, what could it hurt? And so we went up to the very official man and said, can we see Papyrus 52? And he said, where are you from? And we said, we're PhD students from the University of Sheffield. And I remember the man said, nothing good ever came out of Sheffield, not even the beer. I thought, this doesn't look very good. And so Chris said, "Can we see P52?" And he said, "Sure." I couldn't believe it. He ushered us into this castle-like room, something looked like Harry Potter. And I remember the library man coming in with two sheets of glass, and between it was Papyrus 52, which was the oldest copy of any section of the New Testament. And it dates from about 20 years from when the Gospel of John was written. And I couldn't believe we're standing in the same room as P52, the oldest manuscript. Then it was the oldest manuscript we had. And my friend Chris said, "Could I hold it?" And I wanted to say to Chris, do you know what English prisons are like? They don't have indoor plumbing in English prison. If you drop that thing, we're never going to get back to America. And I remember my friend Chris Thomas twirling P52 by the edges of the glass between his fingers. 20 years from when John was written. It was a page from the last page of the gospel. So we have a few manuscripts like that, really old, really close. Most of the ones we have are medieval manuscripts, maybe the 10th century, the 12th century, right up to the founding of the printing press. But the second canon of textual criticism is this about textual families. So if you imagine that John sent a copy to Caesarea, Rome, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and imagine that one of those copyists who got his manuscript, imagine that he made a mistake. Maybe he left out a sentence. Maybe he added a sentence. Maybe he misspelled a word. The result would be that every manuscript then that was copied from that mistaken exemplar would include the error, or at least most. Scholars have recognized that while a scribe can infect all the ones that were in his geographical area, the fact that he isn't in Rome or Alexandria means that the other manuscripts won't be affected. And so that's why when scholars come to this, they classify manuscripts where they come from. And when they see a reading that only occurs in one family, they infer that it was a mistake in that one family, but God in his providence saw to it that there were many other manuscripts, and so that mistake cannot infect the manuscripts elsewhere. This one, the harder reading, might seem counterintuitive. But when and it has a Latin name, Lectio Difficilior Patior. The more difficult reading is the more important reading, or the weightier reading. And let me try to explain to you why this is a valid canon. When I was in England, I was so pleased. I did a pure research degree. There were no classes. I never did anything but 9 hours a day, 8 hours a day in the library researching one question that I found important. And I was able to do that for 4 years, and I loved it. I loved that. There was one assignment for 4 years, write a 200-page paper and defend your thesis when it's over. That's how all British research degrees work. And you can imagine if you're doing work like that, you need a way to take a break. And so every day about 1 o'clock, I would be a little tired and I would need to take like a 15-minute break. And one of the things I did was I got a book of famous naval stories. And I would, in my 15-minute break, I would read about these famous naval battles. And I came across one. It was by Winston Churchill. It was the account where John Paul Jones fought a much superior ship. And the name of that reading is How the Gardener's Son Fought the Serapis. And it's the story of this kind of nobody from Great Britain, whose dad was a nobody, but he came to America as a land of opportunity. He started in the Navy. He rose to the rank of Commodore. And he's the one who, in the battle with the Serapis, was asked, "Sir, do you strike your colors?" And famously he said, "Sir, I have not yet begun to fight." And so John Paul Jones has sailed his little merchant ship, the Bonhomme Richard, the good man Richard, and he attacked the Serapis, which was one of the supreme British ships of the time. His little bitty ship fighting this massive ship, and he ran it together, and they were each blowing cannon holes in the sides of the others. And it was about 100 miles off the coast of Great Britain. Well, you may or may not know that the water there is cold, and if you go in the water, you'll be dead in seconds. And so they're fighting this battle, and John Paul Jones, his ship is starting to sink. And when his little ship, the Bonhomme Richard, was sinking, one of his junior officers released about 100 British prisoners of war because he didn't want those men to drown. And so John Paul Jones is on a ship where they've thrown grappling ropes over the Serapis. They're bound together. They both have their cannons blowing holes below the waterline, and his ship is sinking, and his junior officer let go 100 prisoners. Well, the first thing John Paul Jones did is he knocked the junior officer silly, took his sword and hit him in the face and knocked him out. And then John Paul Jones jumped on a barrel and screamed, "It's not our ship that's sinking, it's the Serapis. If you don't get back at the pumps, we're going to die. We'll all go in the water and die." And they were able to get the 100 British prisoners back to the pumps, and they're keeping their boat afloat by pumping water out faster than it could come in from the cannon holes. That's when the British commander said, "Sir, have you struck your colors?" And John Paul Jones screamed back, "Sir, I've not yet begun to fight." They fight on for hours, it seemed, and then the Serapis started sinking. So now both boats are grappled together, and they're both sinking, and if they go into the water, they're all dead. That's when the British commander struck his colors and surrendered. And as soon as the British commander struck his colors, John Paul Jones screams out, "The Bonhomme Richard can't be saved. Everybody go to the Serapis." And so they go on board the Serapis. The Bonhomme Richard sinks. John Paul Jones sails the British ship home to America, and they rename it, and it becomes an American battleship. Now that's a great story, isn't it? You read that story, and I've read it many, many times, and you just see the courage and the intellect, and I've cried like a baby reading that story, and I love that it was written by Winston Churchill because he's one of my favorite people. But after I read, and this is a picture of that battle, as I read that, I noticed that the book that had that story said the story was written by Winston Churchill, and that it comes from a book called Richard Carvel, and that Winston Churchill was born in 1871 and he died in 1947. And that's simply a lie. Winston Churchill lived during my lifetime. I was born in 1963, and I think he died in 1965. I wasn't sure when he was born. I thought it was 1881, but I thought they just got these dates wrong. Now, if I were a scribe and I were copying out the story, how the gardener's son fought the Serapis, and I had the name Winston Churchill, and I knew that the dates were wrong, I would be very tempted to fix the dates. So I was wrong about it's 1874, because I would assume that this date was wrong. Well, little did I know that that story that I'd read so many times wasn't written by Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister. It's actually written by a man who at the time was more famous, an American writer named Winston Churchill. In fact, he would be like the John Gresham of our day. He was so famous that that's why they always call the Winston Churchill we know Winston S. Churchill. But you can see, how, can you not, that if you come to something and you assume that your manuscript has made a mistake, you would be very tempted to fix the manuscript. And we have evidence of that all over in the New Testament. People coming to a passage that they don't understand and then changing what is hard into what they presume is an easier reading. Fourth canon, the shorter one is usually the better. We see that in the manuscripts over time, people will write something like the love of God. The next one will write the love of God, our Father. The next one will write the love of God, our Father, and the Lord Jesus Christ. You just get kind of this unconscious adding things to the text, and we can see that tendency. So other things being equal, usually it's the shorter reading that's right. But the canon that is the queen of all the canons is the reading that can explain how all the others got there is the right one. So when you come to a text and there are differing readings, what you do is assume that each one of those is the right reading, and can you explain how the others got there? And when we do that for, say, the ending of Mark, this is how it goes. You've got four endings. Which one can explain how all the other got there? Most scholars think it's the nothing ending that can explain how all the others got there, because they don't understand that Mark is using irony. Mark is a pastor of a church in Rome. That church is being persecuted. And so he writes the end of his book, and he ends it with a statement where, ironically, he says, and the women told no one because they were afraid, and he shuts the book. And the people in his church begin to murmur and cry out, how can they have the best news in the world and not tell people? And Mark says, well, what about you? You have the best news in the world too. And are you going to keep silent because you're afraid, or are you going to go out and tell people? Mark is using that, at least some scholars believe, I believe, as irony, and he's wanting the people to begin to judge the women, because he's going to say, look, you're in the exact same circumstance. You have the best news in the world, and you're afraid you might die, so you're not telling the people you know. Don't do that. Some people, some copyists, not understanding what Mark is doing, thought, well, okay, the last page of my manuscript is defective. And so they tried to fix it in two different ways. One copyist tried to fix it by summarizing what the other Gospels say in 2 sentences, and that was his sentence. The wonderful thing is we can date manuscripts, we can see when they were written, we can see the families, and we can see there was a scribe who did that. He left his fingerprints all over the place in terms when we look at the 5,000 manuscripts. Another scribe came along and he said, well, obviously the last page of my manuscript is missing. And so what he did, and this is what's printed in 9 through 21, he, for the most part, just went to the other Gospels. And he just took sentences from the other Gospels. He put those together and he fixed what he thought was wrong in his manuscript. I'm not sure where he gets the whole thing about drinking poison. It may be when Paul is bitten by the snake, that might have been what he was thinking about, but all the other things virtually come from the other Gospels or Acts. And then some manuscripts came and they found two different endings and they didn't know which one to put in it, and so they just put both of them in there. But when we look at the evidence, the earliest favors the ending at verse 8. The geographical ending favors the ending at verse 8. The harder reading favors the ending at verse 8. And the one that can explain how all the others got there favors verse 8. And of course, it is the shorter reading. So all the canons point unanimously to ending Mark's Gospel at verse 8. But the editors don't want to make that decision for you. So what they've done is say, even though we're pretty certain this isn't what Mark wrote, we're going to include it because it's been in the tradition so long, but we're going to mark it. We're going to let you decide. We're going to let you be a Berean and see if these things are so. And of course, the nothing ending would correspond with the messianic secret in Mark, which is don't tell. It's don't tell, don't tell, don't tell, don't tell, don't tell. And then at the very end, it's do tell. And what do the women do? They don't tell anybody because they're afraid. When we come to passages like this, we have 5,000 manuscripts. It's certain that verse 4 was added by a later scribe, so it's not even included in square brackets. And I think what we step back, at least for me as a Christian, text criticism doesn't cause me any worry in my heart because I know that the people who've done this work have done it very carefully, and they're some of the smartest people on the planet. I had the good fortune to study under a text critic, J. Harold Greenlee. I had one class with him, and he was one of the men who actually worked on the Greek text, and he was easily the smartest human being that I'd ever met. He knew 65 languages. Why don't you think about that for a second? Somebody who knows 6 languages knows a lot of languages. Greenlee knew 65 languages. He did his PhD at Harvard. He studied manuscripts where originally they had been written one way and somebody had scraped off, turned them sideways, and written another document on top. Those manuscripts are called palimpsest, re-scrapers or re-scrape manuscript. Greenlee used to joke that he was one of the top palimpsest readers in the world, but then he would say there are only 3 of us who do it. So here's a guy, Harvard, PhD, 65 language, spent his entire life trying to figure out what exact ancient Greek words were on very difficult manuscripts. We can trust what we have, but we can also trust because we have a God in the heavens who wants us to know exactly what he has for us. And he's given us the evidence. We just have to work for it. We have to be willing to look. When we look at these, if you compare what we have to what's true in other fields, this is how it compares. If you're reading Plato, we have 7 ancient copies of Plato. The oldest copy we have of Plato was about 1,200 years after Plato wrote. When I studied classics at Georgia, we would have classes, or at least one class we had, where the book we were reading, the Athenian Constitution by Aristotle, the first page of that book started ... because we only had one manuscript, and the manuscript that we had was missing the first page. 7 for Plato, 8 for Herodotus. When we come to the New Testament, we have almost 6,000 manuscripts. Some of those are less than 100 years from when the documents were written. And I think even these numbers are slightly out of date now. This is the copy of P52 that they let us see, and the framing of that is not what I remember it looked like. When we saw it, it had lead framing around, and it looks like it's in a humidity-controlled environment. Now, that wasn't the case when the guy brought it out for us to see. But this is a passage from John, and we know it's from John because it has the word name Pilate on it. And the graduate student who found this was just sifting through, and he saw the name Pilate, and there's so little historic evidence for Pilate, he started looking carefully, and he realized that it was the last page of the Gospel of Mark, and we can reconstruct how big the page was, and it agrees exactly with what we have. Well, that could be within 20 years of when it was actually written, certainly within a generation. This is what each side of it says. When we step back from the 5,000 manuscripts that we have all these ancient translations. So if we were doing textual criticism in Shakespeare, and we were at the Folgers Museum, it would be a little bit easy because all the documents are in English. The Bible is so important that it was translated into many, many ancient translations, translated into Aramaic, Greek, Syriac, Latin, Coptic, Gothic, Armenian, Georgian, Ethiopic. Believe it or not, there are people who master all those languages just to make sure that you can trust what you have in your printed Bible. And that's what I hope you'll come away with today, the realization that the people who have done this work for us have worked for centuries now seeing that what we have is exactly right. There are very few people who are in textual criticism in the Bible who aren't very conservative in their estimation of its trustworthiness. By and large, text critics believe, hey, you can trust what you have. The people who don't trust it usually, not always, but usually have a bias. And the bias is this: they don't want you to believe the Bible. They don't have time to learn Ethiopic, Syriac, Latin, Aramaic, but they want to speak as experts, but they don't want to do the work. That's a biased witness, and that's an uninformed witness. That kind of accusation against the Bible just doesn't hold true. It doesn't reflect the evidence. What we have, we can trust. And so I see my time has run out. I will see you on Wednesday.